All right, chapter 5.5, Rome's long decline. In about 200 AD, the Roman Empire began to weaken, and the golden age of the Pax Romana had ended. Rome suffered political and economic turmoil and a decline in the traditional values that had been the Roman foundation. The oppressive government and corrupt upper class generated hostility among the lower classes. High taxes to support the army and the government burdened business people and local farmers. Over and over, emperors were assassinated or overthrown by ambitious generals eager for power. Political violence and instability dominated Rome. In 284, the emperor Diocletian set out to restore order. He divided the empire into two parts, and he appointed a co-emperor named Maximian to rule the western provinces, and he controlled the eastern part. To help strengthen the weakening economy, Diocletian slowed inflation, or a rapid rise in prices, by establishing fixed prices for many goods and services. When the emperor Constantine came to power, he continued Diocletian's reforms. In addition, he granted toleration to Christians and moved the empire's capital to Constantinople, making the Eastern Empire the center of power. While these reforms helped improve the situation in the empire, they failed to stop the long-term decline. Nomadic peoples from Asia, called Huns, were forcing Germanic peoples into Roman territories. Fierce battles happened, and by 410, Rome itself was under attack. By then, the empire had surrendered much of its territories to invaders. Roman power was fading. And there were several reasons for Rome's decline, but the primary reasons were the many invasions. Rome's legions were not strong, nor were they loyal as they had been. To get more soldiers, Rome had hired mercenaries, or foreign soldiers, to serve for pay, to defend the borders. Many of the Germanic warriors who did not feel loyal towards Rome were actually being paid to be Roman soldiers. As Rome's citizens were suffering the consequences of the declining empire, patriotism diminished, and the upper classes, which had once provided leaders, now were devoting themselves only to luxury and the pursuit of prestige. The Roman Empire finally fell in 476 AD, when the Germanic invaders captured Rome and ousted the emperor. The power of Rome had ended. Well, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, was probably the last really good emperor before things started to go downhill. His son, Commodus, was extremely unpopular and was actually assassinated while he was sleeping. And then it brought Rome into complete chaos and violence. So that there was a huge vacuum, and Rome was in need of a strong leader. And that strong leader was found in the Emperor Diocletian. Marcus Aurelius had died in 180 AD, and this ended the Pax Romana, and it led to a series of hostile takeovers. There were many different generals who were fighting for control of the Roman Empire. And sometimes there was even provinces that broke away from the Roman Empire and were ruled by generals who never even came to Rome but stayed in their own territory and ruled from there. So it was a time of chaos and political violence, which during one 50-year period of time, there were 26 different emperors who ruled, which that's going to be very, very difficult for the average person to make decisions about their future and things like that, because it leads to a lot of uncertainty. Well, social and economic problems began to arise because of all this uncertainty. Higher taxes, they continued to grow and grow. And the thing is, it didn't influence the really wealthy because they were able to avoid taxation. The ones that it influenced were the middle class, the farmers, and the business people, the business owners. And this group of people paid a heavy price for making money in this time period. So they ended up, many of them were unable to pay their taxes and eventually went bankrupt or had to sell their farms. And this led to a bunch of people who were still working on their farms, but they didn't own their farms. And it's going to lead to what we call the feudal system, where there are people who are tied to the land. They're not able to leave. And we call them serfs. But another problem was that the farmland was becoming more and more infertile. I think because of over-farming and possibly because of the weather shifting a bit, the Italian peninsula was becoming less and less able to support its population. And so that combination, the uncertainty of crops being produced and the fact that crops that were produced, the price for them goes up, so that cost of food went up and inflation went up because the money was not worth as much during this time. So you had to use more money to pay for less food. It was a bad combination. Lots of poverty and starvation. Small farmers had to move to the estates of wealthy people, and they were not allowed to leave the land. And many soldiers by this point were being hired that were not Roman. They were mercenaries. They were paid oftentimes with land on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. Armies were often used to put down civil wars rather than to protect the empire. They were busy fighting against their own people rather than helping to protect the borders of the Roman Empire. This is going to lead to a lot of problems. In AD 284, Emperor Diocletian appointed a co-emperor named Maximian in the western territories of the empire. So Diocletian maintained his empire in the east, and he gave the west to a man named Maxentian. And this was to help ease the problems of administration, because it was just way too big in order to try to administrate the whole thing. And so actually he divided it into 4 pieces with a co-emperor and a Caesar. A Caesar was considered a lesser rank, but would help with the administration. One for the east and one for the west. So there would be Caesar and a co-emperor, and a Caesar and a co-emperor. Well, eventually, Diocletian, he died a horrible death with lots of boils, etc. It was health problems that caused his death. But when he died, a new man came to the throne, and he came to one portion of the throne, and his name was Constantine. In order to curb the inflation, though, Diocletian had a few ideas on how to fix the problems. So he stopped any rise in prices for certain items. Anything that was considered a staple was it was prohibited for them to increase the price anymore. And he required that all sons of certain necessary trades, they were not allowed to change their trade. They had to remain within that same profession. And this was probably because those professions, even though they were necessary, they weren't paying enough. So sons were trying to find other means of employment. But with these new laws, those sons would now have to remain in that employment, in that profession. And also, he required that farmers remain on the land to continue producing grain. So he wanted everything to stay the same. He tried to legislate or create rules to make everything stay exactly the way it was. And that doesn't really create a solution. It just postpones the inevitable, which is eventual collapse. So there were really no easy solutions, and his solutions were basically just to strong-arm people into doing what went against their own good. But actually what it did was it set up a system that would be called the feudal system in a few generations in the future. Well, Diocletian's eventual demise brought about Constantine's rise. Constantine was the illegitimate son of Diocletian, and he was not handed the throne. He had to fight for it. He eventually did away with the Caesars, and then his final rival was Maxentian. And the story of his defeat of Maxentian is what also was the rise of Christianity. He was on his way to defeating Maxentian, who was based in Rome, and he was just on the outskirts of Rome. He only had a small contingent of forces with him. His other soldiers were following behind a few days, and he had a choice. He could either attack and take Maxentian by surprise and possibly have the advantage, or he could wait for his troops and then attack, but he would have lost the surprise and probably lost the advantage in the battle. So there are different versions of the story. One is that he saw a sign in the sky, which some historians think may have been a meteor or possibly clouds. We don't really know, actually, because it's not clear. But the other version is that he had a vision or a dream where a sign was given to him by God, and by a voice that said, "With this sign you will conquer." And so he wakes up and he tells and there were some Christians in among his troops. And when they hear about this, they say, "This is of God, and this is what you need to do. You need to make the sign of the Chi-Rho." The Chi-Rho, just like this. And it's basically, it was a Christian symbol, and it is this Greek letters for Christ, and they're laid on top of one another to form a symbol that means Christ. And so these Christians in the camp told him that he needed to paint these on the shields of all of his men, and reluctantly they did so. And they in turn won the battle, called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where there was a bridge near the city of Rome where all the troops had to cross over, and there was a bridge that had some linchpins in it that, when strategically pulled, would cause the bridge to collapse. And this happened while I think Maxentius was on the bridge, and he fell into the water, and because of his armor and the mud that was underneath the bridge, he eventually drowned and was killed. But throughout the battle was kind of chaotic. But at the end of the battle, he was drawn up after he had died, and they chopped off his head and stuck it on a pike and paraded it through the streets of Rome. And Constantine very graciously told the Roman citizens that he had liberated them, and they were no longer under the tyrant Maxentius, but were now free under him, and he was going to restore their liberties. So they graciously or diplomatically thanked him very much for his kindness towards them. A few weeks later, he was up in Milan, which is in the northern part of the Italian peninsula, and he issued an edict called the Edict of Milan, which granted religious toleration to Christians, because Constantine realized that Christianity was a powerful force within the empire to unite the empire. So he probably did have religious conviction, but he was also very pragmatic. He was very practical, and he realized that Christianity would be a useful tool for unifying this very fractured empire. And this was something that he desperately needed at the moment. So he issued the Edict of Milan in 312 AD, which granted religious toleration to Christians. He also did one other very, very important thing. He moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to a small town on the Bosporus called the Byzantium. Well, he called it Constantinople. He renamed it Constantinople. And this town, or this city, became the new capital of Rome. New Rome. The new Roman capital. It was very strategically placed because it was right on the crossroads of the trade routes that go between Asia and Europe. Yes. About 50 years later, a new emperor came to the throne. He was 2 emperors away from Constantine. His name was Theodosius, Emperor Theodosius, and he went a step farther and made Christianity not only legal, but the religion of the Roman Empire. And this was actually kind of a negative thing for Christianity, because if you were a Christian and not part of the Roman Empire, let's say you lived in Persia, and you were now seen as somehow connected with Rome if you were a Christian. So the Persian government started to persecute Christians because of their connection to Christianity, because of its connection to Rome. You could have been a spy for all they knew. So they were using that as an excuse to target Christians that were not in the Roman Empire. Well, in a slight tangent. So in AD 370, a terrible group of people began washing over the Roman Empire. Actually, several different terrible groups of people. One of the first ones were the Huns, and they were originally from Central Europe, and their moving around and attacking other people groups caused a ripple effect, caused the Germanic peoples that lived closest to the borders of Rome to start pushing up against the Roman Empire. And they were just trying to get away from this new Asiatic group of people that were moving in on them. So the Huns came in 370 AD, and they pushed the Germanic peoples into the Roman Empire. Some of these Germanic peoples were the Goths, the Visigoths, and the Vandals. Later, in 378, 8 years later, the Visigoths were so numerous that they destroyed the Roman army in the Battle of Adrianople. And in 410, about 30 years later, the Visigothic general named Alaric ran through the Italian peninsula and completely overran the Rome and sacked it. And this was shocking to the Romans. They had never had quite this close of a call with barbarians. In 434 AD, Attila the Hun, who had his people had begun this wave of invasions, he showed up in Europe and savagely destroyed anybody that they came across. They were a very vicious group of people. But it wasn't until 476 AD that Rome finally fell. Its last emperor, Emperor Honorius, was dethroned and done away with. Rome's influence did not completely disappear with the fall of the Rome. An emperor ruled in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, or what became known as Byzantium, for another 1,000 years. Although instead of speaking Latin, they spoke Greek. The newcomers to the Roman Empire, or the Germanic peoples, were very influenced by the Roman culture, and many of them adapted a lot of things into their own culture and made it into kind of a blend of Germanic and Roman. The church also preserved a lot of elements of Roman civilization, especially the hierarchy of the Roman church. And finally, citizens continued similarly to what they had been, how they had been living in the Roman Empire. They were now just living with Germanic leaders rather than Roman leaders. So some of the problems that Diocletian had been trying to solve, the problem of inflation and labor shortage and infertile land, all those things just continued, and the problems did not go away, and so it lended itself to what became known as the Middle Ages.